Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, man of many hats, Brian Foster. And today we're just going to be talking a litany of subjects. I don't have a coherent theme, Brian, so I'll let you introduce yourself. And if you can think of anything that ties our daily show together, let me know.
What's going on, Dre? I love litanies, but I do have a theme for you, which is it is less than 2 weeks until the NBA preseason. October 3rd is when it starts, and training camp is going to be underway soon. So yeah, the theme is get ready for the new NBA season. That's my theme.
All right, I'll take it. Although we're barely going to be talking that at all. Discuss our sponsor real quick, and then we'll get on to our show. So our sponsor is dailyroto.com. If you haven't heard of Daily Fantasy Sports, I'm shocked you're listening to this podcast or any podcast for that matter, but football season is back, which means fantasy sports and daily fantasy sports is back. So if you go to dailyroto.com and use promo code NERDNUMBERS, and by the way, they do have an NBA package, as Brian noted, that is coming up in less than a month. You can play any given sport. They have optimizer tools, everything you need to win at Daily Fantasy Sports. Promo code NERDNUMBERS gets you 10% off. All right, on to the show. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about around the NBA. It's slim pickings because it's the end of the offseason, so we're down to the names of Thabo Sefolosha and Andre Iguodala. We're going to talk some tampering, maybe, Brian, and then we're actually going to revisit some stuff from last week. So I actually do have a Last Week on Lost when we review comments from last week, and I'll do that first, then we can get on with the show. So I wanted to give thanks. Let me get the name correctly. Dodgson noticed that I said Charlton Heston was the angry old man that played in the movie The Mule that John Mulaney made fun of on SNL. But it was Clint Eastwood, not Charlton Heston. Apologies. I got confused at the old guy that was nuts about guns. But yes, Clint Eastwood was in a movie called The Mule, which is about a senior citizen drug mule. And we were noticing that in which movies are greenlit by studios and how there tends to be a weird slant towards old white guys for some reason.
I'll point out Clint Eastwood was also in a movie, I think it was Gran Torino, where he literally says, "You kids get off my lawn," and he has a gun and he chases these kids away. So yeah, he's got that demographic covered pretty well.
Yeah, it is a lot of wish fulfillment. I saw a really funny tweet that noted that when female writers write things, it's called fan fiction and kind of derided. And they brought up Dante's Inferno and said basically that was like fan fiction where a guy named Dante wrote, he was like, what if I was in hell and hanging out with all these people? And it's like, okay, he's a Mary Sue if we're going to get down that stupid rabbit hole. I wish I hadn't even invoked that term. But yeah, there are a lot of movies like we're saying this on the cusp of Rocky, or not Rocky, apologies, Rambo, the 20th sequel or whatever coming out. And I don't know if I want to look into it, Brian, but apparently it has to do with like the border in the United States and it's fulfillment. And it's like, I tell you, some of the movies that is just like old white guy with a gun is able to solve all the problems by shooting things is not the most fun thing to realize is popular among a demographic of people in this country. Actually, Brian, I have a brief second for a tangent unrelated to everything, but I found it amusing. So in my state of Wisconsin, they're looking at getting medicinal marijuana legalized, which is, good, catch up with the rest of the country. I think Michigan and Minnesota both do. I'm not sure.
It's coming in a lot of states. Yep.
What was amusing in a sad way is I was on Facebook and I was reading the comments about this, and somebody made the claim that in Wisconsin, if you were going to do medicinal marijuana, they were going to take your gun away. Which, first off, I was like, oh, well, you sold me even more. Second off, I was a little like, are you really going like, I can either keep my gun or get medical help? Is that really a decision? But what was even more amusing is I went and looked it up, and the bill that was proposed immediately after the medicinal marijuana one was actually a rule that says, for background checks, they are not allowed to look at any registry for medicinal marijuana, meaning the exact opposite was true. As in my state, they are saying they're trying to legalize weed while at the same time saying if you're using weed, they can't use that in any way to take your gun away. So first off, the classic annoying way that social media spreads misinformation. People say something, no one looks it up. I actually went and read bills, which is a hell of a lot of fun, Brian.
Welcome to my world.
just say the exact opposite. And then second, that is a funny part of the U.S. nation where we literally have bills written into effect that are concerned about guns before we've even legalized a thing. So, it is what it is.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say about that, but Clint Eastwood, what a career, what an actor. What a director. That's how I'll close off that segment.
I haven't liked a lot of the I mean, if you look at the movies, a lot of the themes have gotten problematic. What, $1 Million Baby? It's like, oh, if you get paralyzed, your life doesn't matter. Like I said, there's a lot of the old white guy with a gun can just solve everything by shooting things. Liam Neeson's also taken up that helm. So, they have a niche. They certainly make money. I know why they make money. I'm not happy about it. Let's get on.
I'm sure we can have Taken 7 come out in the next year or so and keep that franchise rolling.
So many problems with those movies too, Brian. We could spend an hour just on like, wait, what? Okay, so I didn't realize this, but apparently the Houston Rockets are signing. Is it Thabo or Tabo? I always thought it was Tabo, but let's look up the pronunciation real quick. And
I thought it was Thabo, but I don't know.
It is Thabo.
Thabo. There we go. Hard T.
Sefolosha. Now, we were kind of talking this pre-show. The interesting note is he is a productive player. I believe we've liked him. I think back in the day, he was part of this weird Rockets squad, or not Rockets, sorry, Bulls squad that had a bunch of underrated good players. And of course, Derrick Rose got all the credit, but he is now into his 30s. Last season, he only played 50 games at about 12 and a half minutes a game, only 600 minutes net. So, I mean, this isn't a horrible signing. And something I don't know who said it. It might have even been Mark Stein as well. But somebody was noting that his 3-point shooting is quite well. And he was at about 40%. So I'll give that to him. But it is, he's a little older and I'm not sure how much he'll matter. You had some good takes, though, where you noted, one, if he takes minutes away from Eric Gordon. I'm really, really, really hoping that the Rockets are trying to move Eric Gordon. If they're not, they're making a mistake. He was a mistake to sign. He's a mistake to keep. The only reason to keep him is to have some salary piece to trade away. If Eric Gordon is on the squad, they're not winning a title. Let me phrase it more accurately. Eric Gordon is on this squad and is in the top 6 rotation come playoff time. This team is not winning a title. I'll throw that gauntlet down right now. So that's the first take you had. And the second, though, is you were kind of curious why he was still available, which, I mean, 600 minutes, 34 years old, Brian. I mean, that doesn't...
I know why, but yeah.
But, I mean, I guess what I'll say is I would understand him being available if the NBA was like an efficient marketplace. But with some of the names that came in front of him, I would agree with your point.
Yeah, that's what that comment is about, is I'm really just scolding the NBA for not being an efficient marketplace. But yeah, so we talk all the time about, archetypes of NBA players, the stretch 4, the star player, and the 3-and-D guy and all that. And one of the things I like to talk about is how people try to fit players into these archetypes, but some players are better than others. And just because, you're, say, a big guy that's willing to take 3-pointers, it doesn't mean you should actually take them, right? I always get down on the Morris brothers. Sorry, Morris brothers, but it's true. I'm not a fan of their production very much. So with Thabo Sefolosha, that's a player that is a legitimate 3-and-D player. Like you said, he's very good at shooting threes. He can rebound, he can defend, and he actually does everything you want with the numbers to back it up for being a real 3-and-D player. So considering how teams are going out of their way to overpay for these marginal players that aren't producing, I think it's dumb that they let guys like this walk away. And Andre Iguodala, who we're going to talk about later, despite not being a 3-and-D player, still is one of those guys I think that teams should look at more. And you said it. I mean, the reason why these guys are not getting looked at is because they're a little bit older. But, as far as I'm concerned, if you don't have to put very much money in to get a proven guy that produces year after year, maybe it won't work out. Maybe this will be the year that he won't be able to produce. But I wouldn't bet on that. I would put a cheap bet on that player being good, and I want them on my team. So I just think there's so many more players that have roster spots over Sefolosha that he should have one instead. That's all. If you're going to take a risk on a player, take a risk on a player that's productive and now cheap for a reason. And that was the whole money. That I guess he listened, right? Because we kept insulting Daryl Morey for not being like Moneyball, the movie or the book,
where that's what they would do. They, one of their tricks would be they'd go to a team like the Yankees and say, you spent, $100 million, or probably cheaper back then, right? $50 million over 5 years for this guy who's now in his late 30s. If you pay, if you buy out his contract, we'll trade for him. So you save a little off of him and we'll take him off your roster and we'll pay him $2 million. And it's like, yeah, he's over the hill and not worth $10 million a season anymore, but he's fine as a 7th or 8th batter at $2 million a year. So that kind of thing. And so the Rockets actually kind of did that with Thabo Sefolosha. Of course, they did it because, they're out of money because they spent money on like Eric Gordon. I forgot to bring this up entirely, Brian, but this was kind of a weird story that popped up. So the Rockets had Nene on staff, and Nene was on a non-guaranteed contract. They thought that basically they could assume his guaranteed value, which he didn't hit, and trade him, and he would be worth $10 million. And so obviously that's like an exemption. That's hugely key if they're trying to trade with another team, because like we just said, the way the NBA works, if you do a trade and you're over the cap, salaries have to line up. So even if the Rockets found a $10 million player they really liked, if they don't have $10 million in assets to trade for that player, they can't trade. So they thought it was hugely beneficial to basically say Nene is a $10 million trade asset, and the NBA and the NBA's Players Association nixed it because it was a non-guaranteed deal. So that just happened, and so that's why they're going for Sefolosha. Actually, is that they're backed into a corner.
Right.
They're not making this play like you're saying. Teams should make plays like this all the time. They're making it because they have no choice, and then I think they kind of lucked into it because it's like they also signed Austin Rivers for like $1.5 million this season. So I don't know how much faith I have in them.
Yeah, and it's all about the money. I mean, if things had been reversed and they had signed Sefolosha to a big deal, we would be killing them for that, right? Because Sefolosha used to be good, but he's not a sure thing. So don't give him all this money, right? Or if they had signed Eric Gordon for the minimum, for instance, I'd be saying, I'm not a big fan of Eric Gordon, really. He doesn't shoot very well. But they like his defense, and they like the way he fits in on the team. So maybe if his role is not that big, it's not the end of the world, right? So the contracts changed the context here completely for both players.
Yeah, I saw a funny tweet today that was making fun of one of the tropes, like the scary shop that has cursed items. There was a great Rick and Morty making fun of that as well. That had John Oliver as a get. Actually, no, that wasn't John Oliver, was it? John Oliver was something. Was it John? I think John Oliver played the devil in that episode, correct? If someone's interested, I'm not going to look it up. There's an episode of Rick and Morty that has the trope of the devil runs a shop. You can come in and all the items are cursed. And then Rick subverts it by making his own shop where he removes curses from items. So, ha, 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 ha. So someone had a tweet, though, where someone comes into a shop and they're like, wow, everything I want is in the store. And the shopkeeper says, yes, but everything comes with a price. And the person goes, yeah, I know that's how stores work. So
exactly.
Obviously, just fun subversion of a narrative. But you're saying the exact same thing. When we get into arguments with people about a lot of stuff, it has so much to do with role.
Yes.
And role, I'll slip a little into this positionless basketball trope because we're going to hit that at the end of the show as well. Role can very easily mean how many minutes you're getting, how many shots you're taking, what the team expects of you. So exactly what you're saying. If Eric Gordon is paid $2 million and he's supposed to be the 8th guy off the bench and just take threes, we're probably like, yeah, we don't hate it. But when he's paid $15 million and is in the starting lineup and is going to be taking, as many shots as Chris Paul in a given night, we're like, what the hell are you doing? And, the same thing with Thabo Sefolosha. We'd actually agree most teams shouldn't go for him. But if you're looking for an 8th guy for, I can't imagine he signed for more than $3 million. They don't have that. That's a good thing. So when you're evaluating players, evaluating their role and their contract is huge. And that does get us in. I have to make like a Donovan Mitchell reference at least once every other show, Brian, or I lose my Donovan Mitchell hater card. But like with Donovan Mitchell, that's our funny point where his contract, because he's a rookie, we're like, he's got plenty of time to prove upside. So nothing's proven yet. But then his role, the fact that he's a starter that takes the most shots on the team by a significant margin, we're like, no. So it's very frustrating when you have to add nuance to evaluation. It's much easier to do, one of the things we've heard a lot is, we hate wins produced or win shares or whatever, because it's a catch-all metric, a one-number metric. And I agree, where it actually gets funnier, where you're saying, yeah, you have to look at a blend, not a blend. Blend is stupid because people will like blend win shares and per and wins produced. And that's right out. But you have to look at a multitude of factors, age, contract, role, etc., to determine what you think of a player. And I'm here to tell you that a lot of people that try and face box score metrics against each other, one, that's not the way those metrics are built, and two, they don't even do that analysis correctly.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I remember a year or so ago, I was asking you about this on the show, and you gave me a really good explanation, which is basically, wins produced is not a predictive stat, but don't we really use it like a predictive stat? And you showed me why we don't, right? What we do is we start with wins produced, and then we add all that stuff on top of it, right? It's like, well, here's what he's done in the past, but what about age? What about role? What about a new team or whatever?
And to hash this point home again for the billionth time, but Brian, it's still not mainstream, so it's still worth hashing, is when Dave Barry was looking at the wins produced metric and looking across sports, one thing he did look at was consistency year to year of basketball statistics. And the entire reason for this test is not to prove the validity of a metric. It's to ask ourselves, how much faith do you have in that metric? Because there are players, for instance, in football, unless you're Patrick Mahomes, I guess. Did I get it right? Is it Patrick Mahomes? Pat Mahomes?
Pat Mahomes is his dad, who was a Major League Baseball player. Patrick is the son. All
right, so I did get it right. Patrick Mahomes. Unless you're Patrick Mahomes, you're variable year to year. Man, he is amazing, Brian. I think
he's turned 24 and he's setting more records.
And he's got to have the MVP etched already for this season if he doesn't get injured. But, in football, there are players that, will get 10 interceptions in a season. You're like, holy cow, this guy's amazing. And the numbers really don't back that. So when you're looking at consistency of a metric, so like wins produced, that's just step one to say, do I think this is skill versus luck? And because basketball statistics are pretty consistent year to year, when a player has a good wins produced, we can say, I think this is a good player. But that is step one, because step two is to say, okay, how old are they? Am I afraid of decline? I mean, you can look at their numbers to see if they're declining. Step two, what are they going to be doing on this new team? Because, there are players that have skills, and then you find out they're redundant on a given squad, and, other factors. So you're absolutely right about that, where when we're starting to analyze, that's why we're okay with Thabo Sefolosha. It's going at his price, at the role he's likely to play, at the skills he brings to the table, he is a good fit for this team. And that's a lot more work than just saying this player is better than that player.
Yeah, and one last thing on that. This isn't just like an academic exercise. We said last year's playoffs, that there's a very non-trivial chance that giving Eric Gordon the role that they did, which was basically like the third option, right, behind Paul and Harden, like Clint Capella even though he got paid a lot, his role kind of got minimized in the playoffs. So because Gordon got that huge role, they probably lost the playoffs because of that. Like, it was a somewhat close series, right? And I can't remember 2 years ago when they lost to the Warriors as well. He probably played bad in that series too. So, like, I think it's when they give him this big contract again, it's like they're saying they're doubling down, right? They're going to keep him as the third or so option on the team. And that could be really bad for their playoff chances.
Yeah, 100% agreed with that point. I saw a headline that said something like Rockets owner says, trying to maximize their title window. And I was like, mother blanker, your maximization of the title window was the last two seasons where had you just not signed Carmelo Anthony, not signed freaking Eric Gordon, like you could have had a title had you just not done that. So I agree with that point.
Yep.
Okay. The other big name is Andre Iguodala. I don't know the status. I will get to throw some shade immediately, Brian. I don't know what this tweet is that you have from Damon Ran or whatever his name is.
Damon Rangula. I think he's a Raptors writer. I think he's in Toronto.
Lakers, but I could be wrong.
Oh, Lakers. Sorry, I get all the writers confused.
Here's what I get to. I've said this before, and I'll hold to it. On Twitter, if you block people or mute people or don't follow or unfollow, I've got no complaints. It's your feed. It's you do what you want to do. This guy, he can go fuck himself, though. I am upset.
And I posted a link you can't read. I'm sorry.
Well, no, but here's what I'm going to say he did. So he didn't follow me. That's just fine. He followed me at one point and unfollowed me. I made a Kobe point, calling Kobe overrated. Shocker, I know. And then what he did is he responded to me and insulted me about the tweet. And then I called him out on it. And I said, I don't care that you don't follow me, but if you don't follow someone and then you basically go to their replies and insult them, I find that bullshit. And I called him out on that, and then he blocked me. So it's like, when I did actually curse out there, I'm like, that's well within his rights, and I don't complain. So I'm not going to be one of those asshole like stand-up comedians like free speech, whatever. I'm just saying it was a punk move to come in and to basically not follow me, respond to something I said with an insult to me, and then when I called him out on that, to block me. So yeah, whatever. Let's talk about Andre Iguodala. So you were saying that Andre
Iguodala and his representation have reached a deal with the Grizzlies, which is kind of interesting. And it's a little creative, and I haven't seen anything like this before, so that's why I thought it was worth talking about on the show, basically. So let's bring this up here. But what basically happened was the Grizzlies said, "Look, we're not going to release you, Iguodala. We traded for you to be a trade asset." And let me first, before we get into this, start with the normal disclaimer that we have, which is that the way the NBA and all major pro sports now restrict player movement is bullshit. Andre Iguodala should just be able to go and play for whatever team he wants. It's really dumb. But we have to talk within the constraints of the way the rules are. So within those constraints, this is actually a creative idea, I think, which is they're saying, okay, we traded for Andre Iguodala to be a trade asset, the Grizzlies did. We're not just going to release you so you can go to the Lakers wherever you want to go. We're going to make you stay around so we can get value. But we're also not going to go through the dog and pony show of making you show up to camp, play in the preseason games and be around the team and all that. We're going to let you try to work out your own trade and be away from the team, but we're not going to release you either. It seems like a good compromise for everyone involved, and it seems like it's what Iguodala would want. He's in 35. He probably doesn't want to go through training camp. And the Grizzlies, even though I think it's dumb, I think they should try to make the playoffs and have him play for them. Apparently they don't want to. So because that's their goal, I think it's a decent move for everyone.
I'd agree with that. And I do think it is funny because the very next subject we're going to talk, and this is a nice tie into it, is tampering. So this weird idea of, players talking to each other or players going to teams. I think one of the headlines I saw that this was related to was apparently Kawhi sat down with the Clippers and basically said, I'm not going to join you. You're not good enough yet. A name to approach might be Paul George. And then I don't know. I don't recall, because I skimmed the article, if Kawhi approached Paul George at all about it. And so this idea of players tampering, and tampering meaning talking with players before the official time period is allowed, and then that causing player movement. So the NBA is worried about that. You said on the Wojnarowski podcast, another person that's gotten me blocked.
Yep. What about Brian Windhorst? He was on that podcast.
I think I follow Brian, but so he's saying that the NBA wants to stop players as acting for proxies for recruiting for other teams, and I think what I just said about Kawhi applies. And so this gets very interesting. You're like, wait a minute, why is what Memphis is doing here fine, and then you're starting to get mad at like Kawhi? And we've said this before, and it's not subtle. When players do it, people get upset, and when the ownership does it, people call it fine. Red Auerbach is a genius. LeBron James is a cheater. It's not hard to understand. So that's kind of our not being on the side. And then to keep rehammering a point that I think I brought up on one or two shows now is I get very incensed when there is a rule that favors one group of people. And then they go, okay, well, we're going to start enforcing that rule, but we're going to forget about the group that we weren't enforcing it on, and we're going to start enforcing it on the other group. And the metaphor I bring up for this actually is one of the biggest scandals in NBA history. Tim Donaghy was a ref that was fixing NBA games that was discovered by mobsters, so he was basically betting on his own games and leaking info to the mob. This is crazy. By the way, just as an aside, it is baffling. This is not that far in the past, right? This is like only a decade old, about maybe a little over a decade.
Yep.
And how much it's been swept under the rug. Like I'm amazed at that. So anyway, Tim Donaghy was a ref that would fix NBA games, leak information to the mob to bet on the games. He basically didn't make any money on it because he didn't know what the hell he was doing. And then the mob connections he was feeding information to didn't make any money on it. And then smart gamblers that saw what was happening made a bunch of money. So that is very amusing. But the way he cheated was he called the games very fairly, but he just only enforced it on one team. So in crunch time, he would call everybody who fouled LeBron James. We've heard like a former NBA player, Paul Shirley, when he was on the Short Corner podcast, brought this up. He's like, yeah, there's probably a foul on most drives to the hoop. So he would call more fouls if he wanted to on one team and not the other. And the NBA now has reports for this to say, fouls missed, fouls hit, whatever. That gets lots of fun. But that was what he did. And so we get upset where it's like, okay, well, the referees aren't going to say anything when the teams do it, but they're going to yell very loudly when the players do it. That never sits well with us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this the thing that I thought about when you were going through that is how ridiculous it is that the NFL has part-time referees in regards to corruption, because we've talked about this on the show before, I'm pretty sure, but the political science literature would say governments where they pay the employees better have less corruption because you can't pay these guys to do illegal things. It's harder to do that, right? It still exists, but it's tougher, right? So the NFL is going to say, yeah, we're going to have these part-time referees that we're going to, stiff in the contract negotiations. They recently, very famously, locked out the refs and used replacement refs, and it led to the first game of the season on Monday night having a controversial finish. Why would they go through all that when they just pay, several million more dollars and probably do a really good job fighting corruption? Because I'm not accusing the NFL refs of being corrupt and being under the mob's control, but it would be a lot easier in that case.
The you get what you pay for concept is.
Yeah.
And that's where we notice things get funny, where people will get upset about basically the principle of the thing, right? I don't want to play this player out of the principle of the thing. And you go from a emotional standpoint, I understand why you're saying that. I think you're wrong, but I understand it. But from a cold calculating economist standpoint, that's just wasting money and being foolish.
That's right. That's right.
Speaking, let's see if I have anything else on tampering. I think not much. I also find that the tampering things just kind of silly in that, we noted this already. The NBA, they have this moratorium before teams are allowed to officially sign a player, but then players and agents are running around, and Wojnarowski is releasing Woj bombs. It's like, why do you need that period, right? Like, just get rid of it. It's stupid. And the same thing, if you don't want players tampering by hanging out with other players, then one of the things that's been going on is people getting upset at how poorly Team USA did. And how much, even Colangelo was like, as we talked last week's show, the old Colangelo who, mucked up the Suns back in the day, traded away Jason Kidd. He was like, I'm going to remember who didn't show up. It's like, well, if you don't want players recruiting other players, you can't also simultaneously have the NBA heavily invested in an organization that gets the best players together to play every couple of years. So I find it very hypocritical, and it reminds me very much of Sam Hinkie in that everybody knows that teams were tanking, intentionally losing games to improve their draft stock. And it wasn't until Sam Hinkie came along and was very explicit, and he was like, I am not going to win until I have multiple top 3 picks. That was his take. And obviously his ownership was okay with it. We thought it was a bad plan, but, is what it is. When that happened, then the NBA stepped in and was like, no, this is too much. So it's kind of like, the things that the NBA calls tampering have been happening forever, right? Vegas knew LeBron James was going to was going to Los Angeles. Vegas knew LeBron James was going to Los Angeles like a year out, but it's only when things get more explicit when people are like, Kawhi very explicitly said he wanted Paul George and went to recruit Paul George that teams get upset. So it's kind of these stupid rules of like, you have to pretend that it's not happening even though everybody knows it's happening. That just frustrates me, Brian.
Yeah, and we say this like in the United States, for instance, with alcohol, right? Prohibition never works. We saw what happened, during Prohibition, and I gotta chuckle out of this because, So this is what I said at the beginning of this segment, right? Why did all this stuff exist? It all exists to help the owners keep more control, right? To keep more control of the players and of the league. But the way it has been in the past few years with tampering, like the owners and the front offices couldn't talk, but the players could. That was the loophole, right? So the loophole in this rule to control the players meant that the players actually had more control than the owners in some situations, right? So like, no, we can't do anything about that. And another thing from this Watch podcast, I haven't listened to it yet, but just saw the headlines from it, right, is that the owners were trying to put in a proposal that would require teams to turn in agents who approach them before free agency. So they're mandating tattletaling, basically, ratting them out. And I guess they couldn't get enough buy-in to pass that, so they scrapped the idea. But that's kind of the direction the owners want to move in, right, is just taking as much control as they can and getting it back, you know.
That reminds me a lot of some of the college scandals. You know, obviously a friend of the show, Jonathan Weiler, is at UNC Chapel Hill, and UNC is like the poster child for a lot of recent college corruption, things like paper classes, agents approaching. And one of the ESPN documentaries, I think it was either Broke or On the Dotted Line. They were talking to an agent, and he was like, yeah, I could drive up directly to the gym where the players trained and talk to them. And he went, you know, there was no security or anything stopping me. And after all of these scandals, there's still no security and no stopping me. So it gets, when you're saying this, you know, they want to tattletale on the agents and all this. I think there is by the way, first off, we've talked this before about agents. Agents have a lot more power that is almost invisible to a lot of analytics people if you don't know where to look. We've heard lots of rumors and rumblings, right? We've heard certain players get signed because they have connections to other ones. Obviously, LeBron James now having Clutch Sports, that's been where a lot of like the conspiracy theories are coming up about this, but it's worth noting that's not a new thing. An agent having control of a lot of players and using that control to wield power on future contracts is nothing new in the NBA. We just don't have it, you know, it's not as explicit, right? It's not written in stone where we can track on Basketball Reference what happened. It's just rumbling stories and what people on the inside know and what they're willing to say. And so now when they're trying to attack that, it's like, no. And it reminds me of the NCAA where it's like, this corruption is bad. And it's like, okay, well, do you want to do anything really, really hard to stop it? And they're like, well, just say you are. But no, we're not going to stop the agents from approaching gymnasiums.
Yeah, and speaking of Clutch Sports, by the way, they recently signed today your guy Malik Beasley, so he will be represented. And it's a good point, though, because what did we see recently is the NBA tried to put this rule in saying you have to have a college diploma, or what was it? It was called like the Rich Paul rule, right? Rich Paul is LeBron's friend who runs, you know, the agency. And that the way they initially rolled out that rule, it would have banned Rich Paul from being an agent, and he complained, so they didn't do it that way. But yeah, I mean, the NBA is continuing to fight against the dam that's breaking open of the players having more and more savvy and control over the league.
I made a tweet about this last week, though, where I said, you know, when one of the top players in the league exerts some control to win, and you see article headlines like, are players having too much control? Because obviously the three big names recently, Anthony Davis, Kawhi Leonard, LeBron James, then maybe to a lesser degree, Jimmy Butler. When people are like, oh my God, these players demanded, our players getting too much control? I said, in a league with the draft, acting as if players now have control because some of the best players in the league were able to, after fulfilling a mandatory 7-year period on their team with their original contract, move where they kind of wanted to go. To act like that is even close to balancing it as like that friend that always forgets their wallet that pays once and is like making a big deal of how they paid even though they never pay. So that's what it reminds me of. And so when
they got no excuse now, you can pay with your phone, Dre. So don't fall for that anymore.
Exactly. Thank you, bro. But that's almost the same point where it's going, things are moving slowly, but it's still somewhat ridiculous for people to act as if the players are like controlling the league and doing all this horrible stuff, right? That wasn't there the Kevin Durant interview where he's like, truth is LeBron James is tampering, controlling the league. And you're like, you know, it felt much like watching Fox News where you're like, what are you even talking about? You just won back-to-back finals MVPs. So, you know, anyway, we'll see where it goes. I always get a little nervous in these situations because owners do tend to slap the players down when they start to show agency. But here's hoping. We'll see where it ends up.
I saw a great Kevin Durant related tweet this weekend, Dre. I'll show my homerism by pointing this out. And I don't remember who tweeted it, so I'll subtweet them. But it was the tweet was basically, With the Warriors with Durant, oh, this is so unfair. We need to cancel the league. They'll never not win the finals. Warriors without Durant, will they even make the playoffs? So it's like, what do you do if you're the Warriors? You're either totally unfair and we should cancel the league, or you can't even make the playoffs. It's one or the other.
Yeah, I've got no problem with what happened there. If players want exert control. Although this actually comes into the next point brilliantly. So we're going to talk Antonio Brown. I get to say Brian was right. You're right about a lot of stuff, Brian. I like your takes.
I was guessing. I was just trying to be a Bayesian.
So here's what we went into. So for those, we might even be behind Brian because I've been following super closely. So the story was Antonio Brown was one of the best wide receivers in the league for Pittsburgh. Got kind of upset with the team, didn't think Ben Roethlisberger was using him correctly, and he ended up getting traded way undervalued for what he was worth, you would imagine, to the Oakland Raiders. Coach Chucky, I forget his real name, really wanted him.
John Gruden.
And then he goes to Oklahoma and Oklahoma/LA. There'll be LA in a bit. Goes to Oakland. Apologies, Brian. Didn't mean to insult.
Let's start with Oak. It's okay.
Okay, so Oakland. Goes to Oakland and just has attitude issues, major problems. But then it gets a little funny because, as an example, he's got complaints about like going to training camp. I guess he hurt his feet in a cryo chamber.
Yeah, I got frostbite, I think.
And then they were saying they wanted to take his helmet away and he was getting upset. So it's like this weird one where he might have had some legitimate points in some cases, but it seemed on the whole the bad outweighed the good. And so Oakland gets upset and they find a way to cancel his guaranteed contract. And so because if he doesn't play the first game of the season, they don't have to pay him, so they cancel him. But then he goes to the New England Patriots, the Patriots, right, for a $15 million 1-year deal. And it's like, oh, this was his plan all along. He wanted the Pittsburgh to trade him and then to piss off the team that he was traded to so that he could, go to New England. This entire tampering thing we were just talking about with Wojnarowski, that's what it seemed like. And so I said that it was like very Keyser Soze-ish, right? That was the narrative. And we love narratives, right? We love the narrative of this smart person doing this. And you took the more logical take, which actually happens all the damn time in sports, which was the Forrest Gump take, where there's just kind of this idiot who blundered his way into a weird situation. And in fact, now he's got sexual assault allegations. And then it got to the point where he started texting the reporters about it and then copying his lawyer on it to the point where his lawyer was like, no, I got no part of this. And then people speculating that he didn't even mean to send them to the reporters. He just CC'd them on accident. So it's like,
whoa,
the problem with he's both an idiot and a major problem. And this idea that is a very fun narrative of, he was a genius that had this plan and was playing 12-dimensional chess a la Donald Trump versus, he was a lucky idiot who, fell into a weird situation a la Donald Trump was more right. So that's where we're at now. And who freaking knows? And the Patriots have waived him and he's still being problematic. And good riddance.
Yeah, apparently he re-enrolled at Central Michigan, so maybe he's going back to school. And of course, he also has to deal with lawsuits related to all that. So, I mean, I guess I try to use Occam's razor for this kind of stuff. Like, it just seemed the most likely that, because especially when you consider someone like Antonio Brown, like pro athletes that are, at the top of their game, like all he does is football generally, right? Like, that's why we say some of these guys can't deal with the real world as well, because all they do is play football. And they don't really have to face other parts of the world that well. And, it kind of reminds me of Tom Cruise in a way. This is a weird analogy, but...
And I like where this is going.
There is a time... So if you remember back to the 80s and the 90s, like Tom Cruise was the man, right? He's in all these movies and everyone loved him and he was great. And then all of a sudden, there's like, oh, wait a second. He's actually one of the top guys in Scientology and he's really crazy and manipulating all these weird events, and it's like, whoa, what's wrong with Tom Cruise? And what I think happened there was he fired his longtime publicist and hired his sister to be his publicist or something like that, and he just went on this rampage of saying all this stuff that I guess his old publicist was keeping under wraps, right? So I don't know if something like that happened with Antonio Brown, but I mean, I guess this death threat was very recent, so yeah, there's something bad going on with him. I don't know.
And what I'll say makes him interesting, and very much applies to sports for us is when we argue against things being right or wrong or things that we agree with, it's important to recognize that we're not defending good people all the time. Sports is, in fact, amazing for that, right? You'll see us arguing about labor negotiations, unfair practices, racism, sexism, etc. And then some of the people that we're defending when we're making these arguments are real jerks, are horrible people, are monsters. Right? I mean, obviously, when Mike Golick said, not Mike Golick, Mike Greenberg, sorry to confuse the mics.
Mike.
Like, this was the most unprofessional thing I've ever seen. It's
right.
Like this burger had back-to-back seasons of rape allegations. The NFL does not care about that either. If you're, there's this weird curve of skill versus off-field things that they're willing to tolerate. And, and then obviously certain things count more. So, being unpatriotic is definitely a bigger hit to you than having assault charges.
Right.
Good job, NFL. And, the reality with Kaepernick is...
And it's being fake unpatriotism, by the way. It's not really unpatriotism.
And what I'll say about, like, Kaepernick as an example is the people that argue he is not a good quarterback, I'm watching the Broncos get destroyed with Joe Flacco. Don't tell me there's not a place for Colin Kaepernick in the league. But there is a reality that he was a little better. He was one tier up from where he was
yes.
have a job. And people don't want to admit that, but, is...
Yes, and that's true.
But I'm saying there is this what that they're willing to put up with versus skill. And then I'm also saying the other way, when we're arguing fairness, we have to realize that sometimes we're defending people that aren't good people. And so what makes this very frustrating with Antonio Brown, the capper of the end of it is going, there are very legitimate complaints about the paternalism in sports and how predominantly African-American athletes in the United States are treated. And what frustrates me about the end of this Antonio Brown saga is people are going to see they were right. And it's like, no, I can agree that he doesn't belong in the NFL for many of the off-the-field issues he has had that are now coming to light, right? Like, I'm fine if you want to kick him out forever, although you should kick out every player like that. So, for instance, Ben Roethlisberger should have been out a long time ago, et cetera. But at the same time, it does, being right that he doesn't belong in the NFL doesn't justify the treatment for other things that were unrelated to that. And I think it's called the just world hypothesis, right? When bad things happen to someone, we want it to be because they're a bad person. When good things happen to people, we want to believe it's because they're a good person. And that's not always the case. Sometimes good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people, et cetera, et cetera. And when we enforce the rules, we want it to be correct. If you're going to punish Antonio Brown, punish him for the things that he deserves to be punished for. Don't punish him for things he doesn't deserve to be punished for. And then when you find out later he did bad things, go see we were right to punish him.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
All right, let's get to, I'm excited about two complaints about the WNBA to make, Brian. I'm going to let you guess the name pronunciation. This is kind of disappointing. So Basketball Reference is fantastic for having name pronunciations for players. And for people that regularly mess up name pronunciations like myself, it's a great place to go. Although you were saying for WNBA, because Basketball Reference does have WNBA data, they don't have the pronunciation guides for some of these players. But the Los Angeles Sparks under Coach Derek Fisher, who, why the hell does he have a job? Why did he get the Sparks head coach job? Very weird, right? We'll talk that in a bit. In a series deciding game in the NBA playoffs, he benched several of his starters, including Candace Parker, former MVP Candace Parker, before the team lost by, I think, 17 points. And they were down 19 at some point. And we bring up the he's Manu Ginobili point about this.
Yes.
So Greg Popovich, way back in the day, there was a game where Manu Ginobili had a terrible half. Greg Popovich played him in the second half. Manu Ginobili went off. A reporter came up and said, Manu Ginobili had a bad game. Why did you play him? And he just rolled his eyes and says, he's Manu Ginobili. And for what it's worth, a better example is Manu Ginobili during a press conference once was explaining reversion to the mean to reporters. He's like, well, if the stats are up here and they're normally about here, you'd expect them to eventually do that. It's amazing. Manu Ginobili, so amazing. I don't know if he's eligible for the Hall of Fame yet, but he should be first ballot if he has not already gotten first ballot.
Is it 5 years after you retire in the NBA? Or
last professional basketball game? I don't know if, like, international ball counts.
Yeah, and Popovich's face during this interview is so classic. We're showing it right now. And I guess I should say the normal thing I want to say about Popovich is his antics in interviews are a joke. Like, even though he's a good coach, come on, Pop, stop bullying reporters. Even when you're right, you shouldn't be a bully.
Actually, funny thing, when we were talking to Antonio Brown, people were calling out, rightfully so, Bill Belichick for doing this to a reporter.
Yeah.
Recently.
It's Dana Jacobson.
Dana Jacobson? Okay, yeah. And because she says, I know it's not comfortable, but I have to ask, how do you feel about the Antonio Brown situation? And he just glared at her and said, we're focused on beating with the Eagles. I don't know who they're playing.
Yeah.
And he just stared at her with a glaring face after. And it's like, mother effer, this is your job. First off, you made the decision to bring, you were part of the decision to bring this guy in. You did play the guy, right? So to now not want anybody to ask you about that, we've said the exact same thing about Popovich. You're an NBA head coach that is getting paid millions of dollars a year. If you want to not have to deal with reporters and the spotlight, et cetera, there are a multitude of coaching jobs with much less spotlight you could take. I'm not even talking NCAA. It's like you go coach high school basketball if you want to just coach for the purity of the sport or whatever. You are a multi-million-dollar coach that is making decisions with a media that is asking questions that they have, are fully within their rights to ask. So it gets frustrating. Yeah. Him saying he's manageable, he's a good player, fine. You're right. When he rolls his eyes and goes off, it's like, I'm sorry. We've said this exact same point about reporters before. Sports are not complicated. There's only so many questions you can ask. So it's like when they go, this player was playing bad in the first half. How are you sure they were going to play well in the second half? I'm sorry. How many other ways are there to say Manu Ginobili was playing bad, then he played well? There's not too many ways to phrase that, especially when you're trying to make it a pithy quip for an end of game interview. So I agree with your point there.
Yeah, and there's and even if someone asks you a bad question, I'm not saying it was in either of these cases. Jacobson, I saw the Jacobson question, it was fine, right? She said she had to ask it. But even if it was a bad question, you can respond in a way to make it a good answer, right? And here's the thing. It's part of the CBA, it's part of the collective bargaining agreement and the contracts to give media availability. Coaches and players, the biggest part of their job is playing and coaching and winning games, but it's not their whole job, right? They're literally being paid to talk to the media. We can argue maybe that's a bad idea. Maybe they shouldn't have to give so much availability, especially right after losses. I don't want to hear what the losing players and coaches have to say. It's always a bad interview, right? But this is the world we're in, so they should realize that. And like you said, be the offensive coordinator if you don't want to have to take that heat. It's very. And let me just say one last thing on this as far as the paternalism. The coaches can get away with that stuff all day long. They say, well, he wins, so it doesn't matter. But then, of course, the players will get buried if they try to do stuff like that.
Yeah, Marshawn Lynch, most notorious.
Exactly. Although he did get some people on his side, but yeah, I think you're right.
It took an amazing amount of PR savvy, and then he made one of the greatest cameos on Brooklyn Nine-Nine. About that, where Rosa Diaz was expecting him to be very standoffish and stoic, and then he was super open. It was hilarious. He's a funny guy. But anyway, so back to, the point is Manu Ginobili, good player. You expect him to play well. This is an elimination game in the playoffs, and benching your starters just to kind of we bring up poker metaphors all the time on this show, Brian. I know you like that. And this idea of sometimes you've got a losing hand, but you just have to take the best odds for you to maximize, right?
Right.
Sometimes you're not going to win, but the question is, are the odds there? And if it's an elimination game in the playoffs, replacing your starters with backups who are probably not as well, even if you're losing, is not the strategy to win. And, one of the coaches that we have given the most credit to recently in the NBA is Brad Stevens, because one of the things the Celtics seem to have realized is it ain't over till it's over. You're down by 20 going into the fourth. Give it a try, right? Because in both the NBA and WNBA, a 20-point lead is just 7 threes. And, 7 threes can happen pretty damn fast. You get 3 stops and 10 made threes, and you're back in the game. So I'm just saying it gets slightly annoying that people still fall for it. And then you were noticing, I want to let you talk about this because you definitely said the buzzword that I like hammering home was old school paternalism. And the Derek Fisher deciding to bench his starters.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so to what you were just saying then, I want to talk about that first. we should not be results oriented here. Like, let's say that if Fisher, well, let's first say what actually happened, which was that they got behind and then Fisher benched 3 players for the rest of the game, right? So first it was Candace Parker, and she's getting all the headlines because she criticized him after the game, right? Also, she's a very famous player. She's won an MVP in the past. So yeah, she got all the headlines. But the other 2 players, Gray and I'm gonna probably mispronounce the name, Ogwumike, they might even be better players. They're the top 2 scorers, and Ogwumike is like 3rd in win shares. I want to say we looked on Basketball Reference before. So these are players that probably should be in the game of winning, right? The Manu Ginobili principle. They've been good in the past. They should be good in the future. So in terms of the results oriented, if Fisher had put in all his bench players and they actually had come back and won the game, I would bet the media would be saying, wow, Derek Fisher, what a coach. He had the guts to make this move, bench all of his stars, put in the bench players, and then they won the game. We should still be saying, no, that was the wrong move, and even whatever the results were, right?
We might do the funny thing, right, where it could be possible if it was like a Kenneth Faried situation. I haven't looked at the sport enough to know where you might be, like that kind of thing. By the way, that once knocked my Nuggets down in a playoff hunt. So it actually was funny. The Nuggets were playing the Rockets, and they were battling for, I think, the 6th seed or something out west. Because the 7th and 8th seed got the Phoenix Suns and San Antonio Spurs, respectively. So 8 got Phoenix, 7 got San Antonio. People were fighting for the 6th seed. Nuggets ended up in 7th seed, and the stupid Spurs knocked them out. But they were playing the Rockets in a must-win game. And we come out of the gate, and we just beat up on Yao Ming, because Yao Ming is their star starting center. And so they make a change, and they put in Dikembe Mutombo. And the fact of the matter is, Dikembe Mutombo is one of those underrated players, especially when like Yao has been injured, where we might even say in short bursts, Dikembe Mutombo is a better player than Yao Ming. And that's what happened. Dikembe Mutombo just boarded like mad, and the Nuggets went on to lose that game. So if that was the situation, sure. But that's the thing is Derek Fisher's doing this classic, coach thing that we're used to, which is they think that by doing stuff, it matters. There's a great comics episode on this, one of their earliest, which is about how doing nothing is sometimes the right move. The great metaphor they use is in soccer. In soccer, if you're a goalie on a penalty kick, you've got 3 options basically.
Yes.
You stand in the middle, you jump left, you jump right. And the problem with this is it is very much like a baseball hitter, because in baseball you cannot see the ball; it's moving too fast. So you have to extrapolate a few milliseconds after the pitcher has released the ball. You have to extrapolate where it's going to be and guess. That's what batters are doing. And so the really good one, the check swing, that's amazing because it means they start and in their brain they're like, oh, wait, never mind. And they do that all in less than a second. It's freaking amazing athleticism. But that's what soccer goalies have to do. On a penalty kick, they have to make a very quick decision. And on that quick decision, it's too late. By the time the person's kicked the ball, it's too late for them to do anything. So they better be jumping left, right, or staying in the middle. And what they noticed on Freakonomics is that soccer goalies stay in the middle far less than they should, given the odds, right? Even if you were treating this as a game of rock, paper, scissors, they should stay still more often. And their reasoning was goalies didn't want to be mocked for doing nothing. And so they would rather take the stigma of completely missing by jumping left, even if their instincts said, hey, stay still, than staying still. And the same thing with the coach. If Derek Fisher, you're down by 19. It's a 2-0 hole, and you're down by 19. And I haven't looked at like the SRS or anything, but I've got to imagine that the Sparks were outmatched. That's what it seemed to be. So they're supposed to lose. But their best bet to win is to leave their best players in. And so by taking out their best players, he actually increased the odds that he's going to lose, but he doesn't want to appear like he's doing nothing. And what's funny is we kind of notice this a lot with NBA teams, is expectation versus reality, I've said. So when teams overperform, think of the Portland Trailblazers. The Portland Trailblazers made the conference finals, which they had no business doing. And yeah, sure, they lose the conference finals, but the end of the season comes and they stay the course. They're like, we had a good team. We're going to do as much. And, heck, they even, turned Cantor into Whiteside. So it's like, good job, right? This team didn't freak out. And that's even losing a star player. Whereas you see other teams that lose in the playoffs a round or two early, think of like the Houston Rockets, and they trade away good players. They don't re-sign players because they're upset that they lost. And that problem is annoying because teams should be honest with themselves And if you go, our best bet to win is to do this, and the odds are against us. We're not supposed to win, but if we try this is our best shot. And that's just not popular. It is more popular. The narrative of what you just said, the coach swapping and the players making a brilliant move. Your fucking Warriors piss me off, and that Nick Uren still gets credit for making, or not, it was your Warriors, right? For making
Nick Uren, yep.
Yeah, he's like, what if you go small ball with Draymond Green? And it's like, one, there's nothing that said you need to make that swap. Two, it's too small of a sample size to know anything. And the only reason it's popular is it's the narrative everybody loves. The narrative of what if the coach makes a daring play at the last second that changes up the outcome of the series.
Yeah, and of course the Warriors famously did move away from that and got a series of 7-foot centers after that. So even they themselves didn't really believe in it, I think. But let's take a higher level view though. So one of my favorite series of articles from the old school Wages of Wins was the coach is wrong. Arturo Galletti, right? American Numbers on Twitter. Follow that guy, of course. And so this is where most of my insights about database coaching comes from anyway. Are those articles, and and one of the things the takeaways I get from that anyway is that the coaches that insert themselves too much and meddle too much, to use kind of a loaded term, tend to be not as good, right? And Greg Popovich is correct. Just play your best players and get them out there. Don't worry about chemistry and, overthinking it too much. And that the X's and O's stuff, what kind of defense you run and what kind of offense you run, that's way less important to winning than just giving the best players, putting them out there in the best roles, basically.
One of the most telling things of that take to me was actually Brian Burke of Advanced NFL Stats, who now works at ESPN. And I remember way back in the day, I don't know if I still have the recording of the show, but he was on the podcast, I think the Wages of Win podcast. And I was asking about NFL coaches. And first off, I saw a great comment that complimented Brian Burke, where they noted that, coaches that don't go for it on fourth down are wrong. And that basically the fourth down bot that is on Twitter that was written by Brian Burke is a better.
I think it's defunct now, but yeah, it was a great Twitter bot at one time.
Oh, it's dead. Oh, that's such a shame because that was such an amazing tool. But basically this idea that NFL head coaches don't matter as much as we think they do, and that's in the sport where there's play calling, whatever. Brian Burke's take was by game time the players really need to know the plays and the defense and whatever. And at that point, it's almost too late for the coach to do a lot, but we still like this narrative of the coach inserting and, calling the right play and all that. And that's football, which is way different than basketball. So I agree with you where the more frustrating aspect of being a good NBA coach, and this was Phil Jackson back in the day, was you play your best players, you let them get themselves out of holes, you're calm at game time. Practice is where it's time for them to learn to do whatever. And come game time, you just play the best combination of players while simultaneously focusing on health for the postseason. And that's the model for success. That's the all-time winningest coach, right? I think he's like second on record in all-time on titles, right, is Phil Jackson. And that doesn't get copied as much as, the coach that shouts or makes big changes or whatever.
I'll put a slight asterisk on that for the NFL because the model that's starting to take place in the NFL is this Patriots model with Bill Belichick that we were just talking about, right? Where the coach is not only the coach, he's also in charge of the general manager and the front office. So what I would say about Bill Belichick is maybe his coaching is a little overrated, but the fact that he controls their roster and that he's very, very modern in how he pays players on the Moneyball side of it means that coaches can be invaluable in the NBA just because they control the roster. But that's a nuanced take. It's still everything you said is 100% correct.
Like you're saying, a lot of the Doc Rivers, the Stan Van Gundy's, the GM coach just has not seemed to have done well. But it could just be the wrong person in the position. Although it might, I don't know on that one. Although to that point that you just made on Belichick, going back, means it's completely right to ask him about Antonio Brown.
Well, so we look at, just really briefly before we move on, like Dean Oliver was hired as a coach recently, right? Not as a front office guy. So maybe this is a trend that can help things, coaches pushing legitimate data onto the front office. Like that's the way it should be going, I think.
Yeah. And last point to make about WNBA, Dave Barry retweeted this actually. I'm not finding it quickly, but basically a playoff game was held in a 4,000-seat arena. And seriously, what the hell? And I do feel it's important to hammer this point home. because there's always this weird take of what the people want to see and the free market decides popularity and all that, where the reality of anything succeeding in business and in media is, you have to spend money to make money, right? And advertising is hugely important. People know this. So when money is not spent on the WNBA, or the WNBA isn't put in marquee spots on like ESPN or given huge venues, that hurts it. And what annoys me about this is we can't even have a fair discussion about popularity of WNBA when the NBA keeps shooting it in the foot almost needlessly. The WNBA has a bunch of NBA arenas it has access to. It has access to a streaming service and all these other things it can use that, in theory, if we're talking like economies of scale, should not be that much money. I mean, we were talking about our frustrations about how poorly they did it, but Basketball Reference just hosts WNBA stats underneath their NBA product. The NBA itself, you've got all this stuff in place that could potentially make it much easier to elevate the WNBA brand, and they're not. And what also gets annoying with that discussion is when you tell people that, they're like, well, the WNBA should be thankful the NBA is giving them anything, as we've pointed out in past, ignoring the fact that the NBA has gotten hundreds of millions of dollars in basically public funding over the years, lots of free help from, say, like ESPN and other sites that play their stuff constantly over the years. The NBA is not this like weird meritocracy that built itself up. It got lots of external help that helped it become what it is. And when the WNBA is not given the same shake or even close to it, it can be frustrating. So I didn't want to put that point out there, and I'm sure we'll discuss it more in the future.
Yeah, and it's funny just to think about that point in the context of, other industries. Like, it's a venture capitalist who's investing in a company, and they say, we're doing great, we're coming for another round of funding. They're like, nah, let's just not do it. Do it yourself. Like, you got to invest to make money, right?
Yeah, well, in fact, that's what gets amusing about investors as a whole is that there is that aspect of like, if you've invested a lot of money, you can end up in the sunk cost fallacy, but it also ends up in the other thing where you go,
Yes.
I've got this great product that is this close to market and it might take more money. And in fact, that, by the way, for what it's worth, that's the real world. In the real world, estimating things is hard, and that's actually a good thing.
Yep.
Because the optimism people have at starting new projects is what makes those projects succeed. Because often, if you told someone, like, my favorite example from my personal life, I studied computer vision in computer science as a graduate student. And the story about the origins of computer vision is, I believe at MIT, one of the East Coast schools, right? They were like, computer vision was going to be a summer project. Their idea was they were going to install a camera on a robot, like a kind of a trash can robot that was going to be able to see and was going to be able to do tours around the campus. So you come up, this robot would see you, and then it would be able to move around and map it. They thought it was a summer project. When I got into computer vision, this was right before like the smartphones took off, and you have camera detection. But like, for perspective, it took 50 years to get to the point where your phone could noticeably know where someone was and draw a square around their face. That was the research I was working on. It was cutting edge when I was in grad school, and then right after, it did take off. But I'm saying that was a 50-year project, right? Project number one, autonomous robot that can see and move itself around by its vision, to 50 years later, we're like, it took a little later, right? So 2010s, we got self-driving cars. It basically took 60 years for what they initially thought was a summer project. And so the same thing is true of like sports, where you want to build up this big brand. It takes time and money. And the same thing happens with investing, right? You were saying a round of funding. That happens all the time in investing. You're like, we're going to need $10 million to get this project off the door or out the door. And then $10 million go by and you're like, oh crap, we need another $5 million. Ideally, right, by that point, you've got something to show. So the investor's like, oh yeah, it's worth another $5 million. And so that's where it gets frustrating with the WNBA, where the NBA is like, well, we gave you some advertising and we showed you at the All-Star game. Isn't that enough? It's like, no, if you want to grow this product, it's kind of frustrating. It's like you want to go one of two ways. It's like either treat it like a real product and focus on it, or like cut it free and let somebody else do it. But the kind of in the middle, like you were saying, that who needs a second round of funding thing, can get annoying.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and even the example in robots that I can think of that, right? Boston Dynamics makes these like kind of like horse and dog looking robots that walk on their own. And they've been doing this for decades, it seems like, and every 5 to 10 years, like another video comes out and people say, "Oh, Skynet, these robots are taking over." But they're spending a lot of time making these robots that can walk on their own.
And that is a lot of things. Incremental change. Okay, I'm going to get us on to our old players. We love history around here. Don't forget, a few weeks ago we were talking time travel. We're even talking like Flynn effect with Devin Dignam last week. Flynn effect being things improve over time, basically. And there are 2 players I want to talk. I want to talk Reggie Miller and Hakeem Olajuwon and give some Twitter shout-outs. So Reggie Miller, I saw someone tweet out something that was like Reggie Miller would be a top X player in the modern NBA. I selected 10. And the reason being is very simple. When Reggie Miller retired, Reggie Miller was the three-point king of the NBA at his retirement. Yeah. He held all the records. And that didn't last very long, right? Then, of course, when Ray Allen retired, Ray Allen was the king of three-point shooting, and now he's been surpassed by Steph Curry. And the point being, Reggie Miller at his peak was the best three-point shooter in the NBA. And that peak would be, I would argue, 1998, he took like 5 threes a game at like 43%, which is amazing. Wow. But I looked this up, right? I looked up his three-point shots per 36 minutes and compared it. He would be 65th in the league in the modern NBA at his three-point shooting rate. Whereas I'm betting, I forgot to look this up and I'm not going to right now. I would bet he was close to top of the league in the NBA in 1998. So it's funny because I routinely talk about how the modern NBA is better than the past NBA, and that's going to come up again in a second. But there are a few players, and the ones I list regularly are Steve Nash, I'd say Reggie Miller, and John Stockton. These are 3 players that I think were in the wrong era for what their style of play could be. Steve Nash could have been a modern Steph Curry, right? Yep. Steve Nash's game had his, and for what it's worth, Don Nelson, I've got to give so much credit to Don Nelson, who is apparently a genius, was really the inventor of the 7 seconds or less. The style of play that eventually won with the Warriors was the creation of Don Nelson. And Don Nelson, I believe, was one of the few coaches that Dave Barry's research showed did actually improve players.
Yeah.
But Don Nelson had Steve Nash in Dallas and was like, for F's sakes, shoot more. And Steve Nash was like, listen, I'm the point guard. I'm supposed to pass. I'm supposed to lead the NBA in assists. But then you see Steph Curry, and even Steve Nash was like, man, maybe I should have shot more. There's that. John Stockton's a very similar thing. And John Stockton's there with the pick and roll. The idea was Karl Malone gets to the hoop a bunch. Question being, should they have done more pick and rolls where John Stockton just pulled up and took a 3? Because John Stockton's three-point shooting was amazing. And then Reggie Miller's in the same boat. Where I go, these players are ones where if you transported them to the modern NBA and just had them shoot threes really well, I think they could be much, much better than they were. And those 3 players I all listed are all first ballot Hall of Famers, right? I believe they all got in on the first run. If they didn't, they should have.
Yeah, that'd be a joke.
So, that being said, that was just an interesting one that came up, and I just tweeted out a few things about it. And DataFox21 has noted that they're looking over three-point shooting rates and are definitely going to look into some of them. One of the players he brings up that is baffling is Michael Jordan, who had like one good three-point shooting year early in his career. And just what happened? Magic and Michael, like early in their career, had like one good three-point shooting year and then decided like not to. Although Magic Johnson did start working on a set shot, you were saying, towards the end of his career.
And Jordan had that good year later on in his career when the line was shorter, right? But that's obviously an outlier.
But yeah, DataFox21 is definitely a person I want to give a shout out for that.
Yeah, I guess I'll have a slight tangent on that, on the Steve Nash, which I was ready to not agree with you when they started with that comment that he started it. I thought it was all D'Antoni, because if you look at the lineage, right, it's like Steve Kerr, Alvin Gentry, to D'Antoni, right? They all had this tie-in, but starting with Nash when he was in Dallas with Don Nelson, that's interesting. I have to look into that.
Because what was interesting, the way this started, I forget who, I think it was like Feltbot. I may be getting the Twitter handle wrong, but I was talking about how D'Antoni could win. Basically, if you brought modern day D'Antoni back to the run and gun Suns in the mid 2000s, or the more accurate one was the Mavericks with Steve Nash and Dirk Nowitzki. If you brought modern D'Antoni there, they could win. And people were saying, no, Don Nelson was originating that idea there, but basically that's kind of the point. It is the Flynn effect, right? D'Antoni built on Don Nelson, and Steve Kerr built on D'Antoni, and now we are where we are. But yeah, this Don Nelson was like the start of it, but it didn't get anywhere close to the peak, which what we've seen is 50% of your shots from three, all of your shots in the paint are from the 3-point line. That's the logical conclusion. And yeah, had some players in the past, had Steve Nash, Reggie Miller, and John Stockton adopted that, they could have been something.
I got to look into this now. I'm a little biased because I spent, the 80s and 90s watching all these Don Nelson teams, but I wonder if his guys did take more threes. That's really interesting. But just to state the obvious, the reason why we're probably talking about D'Antoni now instead of Nelson is D'Antoni just had better players on his team. Like Nelson just never really had the horses to get it done.
I mean, Dallas was pretty good. And actually, that is the funny part, right? When we look at Dallas, right, there were some interesting things. I have so much respect for Don Nelson in a multitude of ways. And one of the other ways is Dirk got injured in the playoffs one year. And this came up when both Klay Thompson and Kevin Durant injured themselves in the finals. I guess Dirk got injured in the playoffs, and they were like, this is Dirk's best shot for a title. And Don Nelson's like, listen, man, if he's not 100% cleared, I'm not playing him. I don't care if Dirk's good to play. I'm not playing him. And he ended up not playing him. And then, of course, Don Nelson doesn't get a ring with Dirk. It takes Dirk another decade to get a ring. But I have so much respect for Don Nelson doing it because it's possible Dirk gets a ring there. And possibly gets injured and is never the same. It doesn't have the same lineage he does. Or it's possible he just injures himself permanently. And, we still don't know what's happened with Kevin Durant. If Kevin Durant doesn't come back, I'm going to be really depressed because he's one of the greatest NBA scorers of all time. So we'll see what happens there. But I have so much, as someone who didn't grow up watching Don Nelson and someone who just kind of keeps discovering him repeatedly through looking up historical stuff, I am wicked impressed by him.
Yeah, he was definitely ahead of his time. The big criticism is he basically didn't hold anyone accountable for playing defense at all. But if he had, a Draymond Green type of player or a player that could, enforce that, he probably could have been a lot more successful.
I'm going to thank Russian Bot on Twitter for this one. So that's the shout out. And then the shout out goes to, I'll basically wind down the show, Brian, with this is our shout out. So I want to give a shout out to Hakeem Olajuwon, who, thank God, Hakeem. This makes me sad, Brian, because on the annals of all-time great bigs with players like Tim Duncan and David Robinson and Kareem, I know Hakeem Olajuwon shows up all the time on that list, especially because, one of the big reasons he outplayed Shaq in the finals. So that's Narrative Street. I think the numbers say Hakeem was a great player, but might not be at the same level as, say, David Robinson. Except, weird tiebreakers such as like finals MVPs and now this might give it to him because he actually came up and said, there's not the death of the big men. Yeah. The modern in the NBA are some of the most talented they've been and are doing things that we didn't think we could do because, he said when he started playing in college, he kind of acted like a point guard. And for what it's worth, remember, Hakeem Olajuwon's one of X players that has a quadruple double. So he brought that up, but he did basically give credit to modern bigs. And I know you and Greg Steele were kind of going back and forth on this about how another shout out, Greg Steele brought up this point about the death of the big as well. And he noticed a very, very astute observation, Brian. I don't know if you read this article.
I did.
What we noticed is he said, if we look at how well players score from the paint and you had to convert that to threes, it is still a monumental gap. So basically, like bigs score like 62% from the paint. Whereas to get threes there would be like a 6-point increase in 3-point shooting efficiency, which is monumentous. So he's saying, one, if you get rid of these guys that are scoring really well in the paint, can you make it up with perimeter shooting? That's a really hard margin. Not alternatively, on the same side, if you get rid of these people who are really, really good at defending the paint, you now leave the paint wide open to people to cut. So this idea that these players whose job essentially is to get really close to the rim, are they dead in the NBA? All Greg did was present here's where the numbers are. And do you really think you could make that up? And he's saying he doesn't think so. And I tend to agree with that point. Basically, layups and threes are the NBA. Layups are key, though, right? Layups have always been key. And players that are really tall have always had a huge advantage in both getting layups and stopping layups. So I don't think the big man's dead. And Hakeem is just saying, the big men of the new NBA are just going to be ones that are more skilled. And I mean, we've seen that. Like, even if you want to think that Rudy Gobert is, just a traditional big, I mean, he's like incredibly mobile, incredibly fast. Obviously, Karl Anthony Towns is basically a shooting guard in a big's body. So it's like, I really like that point that, yeah, while the traditional big that people are used to might not be the same, it's not that modern bigs are bad. And in fact, when we look at some of the modern bigs, like Karl Anthony Towns, I would say Karl Anthony Towns, Clint Capella, DeAndre Jordan, Anthony Davis, of course, we have some of the best bigs in the NBA that have ever existed. And so it's kind of ludicrous to think that the big is dead in the NBA.
Yeah, that's such a great way to put it. We've been hammering this home over the years, and I'm glad to see Hakeem say as well, because he was one of the first centers to, play like a guard at times. He came from soccer, I think, before he played basketball, so he's a versatile athlete, right? And when people say the death of the big man, I think what they mean is when the rules change such that you're allowed to double team on the low post, we start seeing a lot less low post scoring, right? Like, teams just went away from it. And big men, they still get in there sometimes, but now they have to score off offensive rebounds. Or as Greg likes to talk about, they need to be good at being the roll man on the high pick and roll. And they just have to do a lot more things. They have to catch lobs now. That, I think, is more popular than it used to be. So for me, I love watching all these modern big men. I think they're way better than the big men from the 80s or the 90s. And I agree with Hakeem and Greg Steele on this quite a bit. Do you have any more shout-outs, or should I go to mine?
I think that'll be – I probably do, but I didn't put them on the script. I'm just going to say that's it, and that can be our show. So what do you got?
I will get in a shout-out related to NFL coaching and being results-oriented, because we were talking about this early in the show. There is an interview with John Harbaugh, the coach of the Ravens, recently. And yesterday, his team, I don't quite have all the stats here, but I want to say he went for 3 different times in the game, and he failed on some of them, and the team ended up losing the game. And after the game, he said, look, I know the math. We have a lot of guys that look into this. Going for it for 2 all those times gave us the most chances to win the game. And, of course, the media is like, oh, Harbaugh screwed it up. But I'm seeing all the football outsiders and, pro football focus types are very happy with John Harbaugh for being analytically sound and defending it in an interview. So good job, John Harbaugh. Those are my shout-outs.
To be mean, too, they lost 33-28. If he'd made all 3 of those, he'd still have lost 33-31. So I'm baffled.
I think that's part of his explanation. He's like, just look at the math, guys.
Had he made all? If he'd made all? So you said they failed on 2 and made it on 1, or did they fail on all 3?
I don't know. I just saw the interview. I didn't dig into the details of it, but I liked how he backed himself up in the interview. I believed him is all. I just haven't looked into it yet.
Yeah, and I mean, well, that's one of the things that is great about poker and why it comes up on the show all the time is the following. In poker, there are so many times where you see someone make the right decision, and these win probability charts that are really popular in sports as well. The thing about poker is they're exact, right? There's no question, right? You can question if someone's saying a team up by 10 has an 80% chance to win an NBA game, because there might be weird things that they haven't accounted for, such as like a ref being dirty or something. But in poker, it's odds, right? We know the exact number of cards left in the deck. We've seen all the cards too that everybody else has played, so we know the exact number of outs that a person has to win or lose. We know exactly how much it was worth to play this hand, so we know if the decision was right. And there are so many times in poker you see someone, they're a 90% favorite, and they lose, as Brian says, 10%. You said 40% when it was in relation to Nate Silver,
yeah.
But you were saying 10% happens all the time.
It does.
Or 40% happens all the time. Same thing, 10% happens all the time. So when you're looking at the numbers analytically, what you have to accept is for most things that are good decisions, there is usually a chance that they fail, and that's all right. And so I don't quite know, because it's one of 2 funny things. If he succeeded, went for 2 after 3 of the 4.
He also went for it on 4th down 4 times. Man, I love John Harbaugh now.
So what's interesting to me, he failed all 3 times, right? Had he succeeded all 3 times, they would have won 34-33. Had he not succeeded all 3 times but gotten the extra point, they would have lost 33-31. I don't even understand how this is a question. It's not like being down 3, going forward on 4th down to try and get a touchdown and get the win, as opposed to a tie and go to overtime and there's a chance you might lose. That's a decision where I can start seeing the question. the numbers here say I can't fault the decision even just from a high level view of what happened based on the score. So,
and let's also not forget the point after touchdown kick is not automatic anymore. They raised the distance of that in the last few years, and kickers actually don't hit that 95% anymore. It's much less common.
We'll have to look this up. All right. Well, I'll give that. It occurs to me. We'll leave it for a future show, but we'll see if we have to discuss Nate Silver at some point, because he has been depressing, Brian, to say the least.
I'll just say what I said to you, in chat. To be fair to him, is like Nate Silver writes these good books. Like I see him on TV and he says good stuff. He just, for some reason, when he writes on Twitter, it's just, I don't know what he's doing. I don't know. Twitter has a curse on him.
It is shocking that, well, it's not shocking, but here's the joke. Things that you research a lot can be well thought out, whereas things that you say off the cuff, you have to accept may be good or bad. And that's everybody. And so the problem with a lot of the media is we want immediacy. This is your point that you brought up forever, Brian. When we want immediacy in our media, we run the risk of bad takes. And that's kind of one of the frustrating parts of where the analytics movement has gotten, is we want immediate narrative takes with analytics backing, where analytics backing might take a little more time. Actually, there was one more shout out I wanted to give. Last Night Tonight with John Oliver won an Emmy. I almost said Oscar. Won an Emmy, and one of the former Cracked heads of staff, Daniel O'Brien, is a writer on Last Night Tonight. And he now has an Emmy, which is amazing. And funny story, he has a podcast as well called Quick Question with Daniel O'Brien and Soren Bowie. And they actually discuss the Antonio Brown situation in depth. Although it's funny, the situation is one where, like, if you record a podcast a couple of days early and then release a nice edited one, you miss the news. So they didn't know everything that had happened with Antonio Brown. And this was even before he signed with the Patriots. So
yeah, when we talked about him last week, the death threat allegation hadn't come out yet. So that's not a good conversation to listen to.
Yeah, well, I like I said, I still think our take is right, but I think it's funny where you're going. Someone can be a bad person and the system can still treat them incorrectly. And then, of course, the system has plenty of ways to treat them correctly for the actions that they deserve punitive measure for. The NFL really should be more serious about how their athletes act off the field in some of these things, and sometimes they don't. All right, that's been our show, Brian. If you found us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live every week, 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers. Of course, if you missed the live show, you can catch the recap channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. And, of course, we have it in podcast form, the Boxscore Geek Show, iTunes, and Stitcher. Subscribe, upvote. We should read our ratings at some point if anybody actually does leave a rating. But anyway, that's been our show. I've been your host, Dre Alvarez, found most places as Nerd Numbers. Co-host Brian Foster, found on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. See you next week, and NBA 2 weeks away.